At 8:47 in the morning on September 18, 1944, Private First Class Eddie Brennan lay perfectly still inside the hollow ruin of an oak tree deep inside the Hürtgen Forest. From a few steps away, the log looked like nothing more than a fallen relic of some forgotten storm. But inside that narrow rotted shell, a single American sniper waited, unseen, unheard, and dangerously close to 13 German soldiers. 60 yards ahead, the Germans were setting up a machine gun position with the calm confidence of men who had done this many times before. The scar-faced Feldwebel overseeing the work barely spoke. He didn't need to. A gesture here, a hand signal there, and the crew understood exactly what to do. Tripod planted, MG-42 mounted, ammunition belts uncoiled in shining loops on the ground, like metallic snakes. From Brennan's viewpoint, framed by a knothole in the decayed wood, the entire trap unfolded with brutal clarity. He had been inside that log since before dawn, pushed into the narrow cavity by 2 scouts who whispered that he must have lost his mind volunteering for such a position. They weren't wrong. The interior felt more like a coffin than a hide. The walls pressed against his shoulders, and his canteen dug into his ribs with every breath. His left leg had long since gone numb. But discomfort didn't matter. What mattered was the trail the Germans were preparing to cover with fire, the same trail Baker Company would march down shortly before noon. Brennan had studied the battalion plan the night before. He knew exactly where his brothers in arms would be, when they'd be there, how exposed they'd become, and how merciless the MG-42 was at close range. More than 1,000 rounds a minute, a weapon designed not to wound, but to erase. The math was simple. If he stayed silent, Baker Company, 143 men, would walk straight into a slaughter. Yet his orders were clear and written in plain language. Observe, record, withdraw after dark. Do not engage unless discovered. Captain Holloway had even repeated it, leaning in so there could be no misunderstanding. Your job is to watch, Brennan, not to pull the trigger. We need information, not heroics. But Brennan knew better than anyone how doctrine failed in the Hürtgen. The forest itself swallowed sound, sight, and entire platoons without warning. A step in the wrong direction could mean a mine. A moment of hesitation could mean a barrage from artillery already pre-sighted on every clearing. And a machine gun nest, like the one he was staring at now, could end a company in under a minute. He shifted his weight by half an inch. The log groaned. One of the Germans, a young soldier with a thin face and tired eyes, turned his head toward the sound. Brennan froze completely, slowing his breathing until even the rise of his chest became invisible. The German stared at the log. 5 seconds. 6. 7. Then, deciding it was nothing, he went back to stacking ammunition. Only then did Brennan allow his lungs to move again. He could hear his heartbeat inside the cramped wooden shell, loud enough that he feared it might give him away. He refocused through the scope. The kill zone was nearly complete. The MG-42 was positioned to sweep the entire length of the trail, and the supporting riflemen had taken positions in a loose semicircle. A radio operator adjusted his pack, preparing to call back to their battalion once the ambush was ready. They were minutes away from being fully operational. In that darkness of the log, Brennan couldn't help remembering where he came from. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a steel town built on sweat, fire, and hard lessons. His father had worked the Bethlehem steel furnaces until an accident crushed his legs. At 14, Eddie had become the family provider, scavenging copper, pulling apart ruined machinery, learning to identify valuable parts buried in rust and dust. Those long hours gave him hands that were almost armored and eyes trained to spot weakness in metal, in structures, in anything man-made. On Saturdays he hunted groundhogs in the wastelands outside town. A single-shot .22 rifle, no spare ammunition. Every bullet had to matter. Sometimes he waited half a day for a shot. Patience wasn't a virtue for him. It was survival. It was in those abandoned fields that he learned a truth few people ever discover. If he stayed absolutely still, not a muscle shifting, the human eye would pass right over him. People notice movement, not presence. Stillness is its own kind of camouflage. He once watched 2 mine security guards search for him while he sat 15 feet away, perfectly motionless against a wall of slag. They gave up after 20 minutes and walked past him without ever realizing he'd been there. When he enlisted, the recruiter asked what he could do. "Shoot," Brennan said, "and stay still." The recruiter laughed and sent him to the infantry. But by 1944, after North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, nobody was laughing. He had proven himself again and again, enough that his superiors handed him a scoped Springfield and told him to keep doing what he was doing. But the Hürtgen was different. The forest punished the unprepared and devoured those who followed the rule book too closely. The Germans had spent months turning those 50 square miles into a labyrinth of death. Interlocking fields of fire, hidden bunkers made of layered logs, sniper platforms perched high in trees, trails seeded with mines disguised by leaves. American doctrine insisted snipers stay 200 yards behind the infantry. Here, that meant they saw nothing. He couldn't help anyone, couldn't stop the ambushes, couldn't do anything except listen to the distant gunfire and add more names to the list he kept tucked in his pocket. Names of friends, names of boys he'd eaten with, marched with, joked with. Names crossed out forever. He'd gone to Captain Holloway and begged him to reconsider the doctrine. "Sir, the forest is too dense. Let me get ahead of the advance. Let me get into their territory. Let me stop the machine guns before they tear us apart." Holloway had stared at him as though Brennan had suggested jumping off a cliff. "Forward of the advance? That's suicide, and forbidden. You're part of a unit, Brennan. Units move together. That's the only way we survive." But survival wasn't what Brennan had been witnessing. In 3 weeks, his battalion had lost 97 men. Something had to change. That was why he was here now, buried inside a rotting oak tree, staring at a kill zone built to destroy the men he served beside. He watched the Germans make their final preparations. He pictured Baker Company marching unknowingly toward death. And he understood the truth with absolute clarity. If he obeyed orders, men would die. If he disobeyed them, maybe they wouldn't. And in that moment, Eddie Brennan made his choice. Brennan's decision didn't come with any dramatic moment or heroic flourish. He simply accepted that he could no longer sit inside a log and wait while his friends marched into a trap. He steadied his breathing, shifted his weight just enough to line up his rifle, and let instinct, not doctrine, take over. The machine gunner came into full view. His head rose slightly above the shield of the MG-42 as he adjusted the feed belt. A shot any marksman could make. A shot a soldier following orders would never take. Brennan eased pressure onto the trigger. 4 pounds. That was all it required. He knew the feel of it, the way a blacksmith knows the balance of a hammer. He waited for a lull in the breeze, an instant where nothing moved except his heartbeat. Then he fired. The crack of the Springfield echoed hollowly through the log, and the machine gunner fell backward like a puppet with its strings cut. For a heartbeat, the scene froze. Every German soldier stunned by the sound. Then instinct kicked in. Men dove for cover. The Feldwebel shouted orders, but even he didn't yet understand where the bullet came from. Brennan already had the bolt worked. The spent casing bounced off the inside of the log. He found the assistant gunner reaching for the MG-42 grip. Second shot. The man collapsed across the weapon, rendering it useless. Now panic hit them. 3 shots in 9 seconds. The radio operator reached for his pack, trying desperately to call their command post. Brennan didn't give him the chance. One more squeeze, one more body on the forest floor. The firefight exploded instantly. Rifle cracks erupted in every direction as the Germans fired blindly at trees, logs, rocks, anything except the one place the sniper actually was. Their training told them the shot must have come from distance, from height, from concealment above ground. No one imagined an American would crawl into a hollow log like some kind of forest ghost. Brennan spotted a soldier firing from behind a thick oak. He adjusted slightly for the angle and fired through the narrow opening. The German crumpled, and the others hesitated again. Then one of them noticed. A young private, not much older than Brennan had been when he hunted groundhogs back in Pennsylvania. The kid stared directly at the hollow log, eyes widening as realization dawned. His mouth opened to shout. Brennan shot him before he could make a sound. That broke the spell. The rest unleashed a furious volley at the log, splintering rotted wood, tearing chunks away inches from Brennan's head. He slid lower, pressing himself into the decomposing mulch at the bottom, letting the storm of gunfire shred the upper half of the trunk. But they couldn't keep it up. Their fields of fire were exposed. Their positions weren't made to withstand a hidden sniper. Their fear grew with every passing second. The Feldwebel realized the truth. They were facing an unseen enemy who knew exactly where they were and who hadn't missed a shot yet. He called for retreat. German soldiers broke from cover in pairs, one firing while the other fell back, a disciplined withdrawal. But each movement exposed them. Brennan rose just enough to see, worked the bolt, and fired again. One more soldier fell, then another. The forest became a blur of motion, retreating Germans weaving between trees, desperately searching for cover that no longer mattered. The Feldwebel himself moved with the poise of a veteran, low stance, weaving, never staying on the same line for more than a heartbeat. He knew how to survive gunfire. But even he couldn't outrun a well-placed shot. Brennan led him by the width of a boot, accounted for distance, and fired. The German dropped mid-stride, his body folding into the undergrowth. After that, silence returned. Only the distant murmur of Baker Company pushing through the trees broke the quiet. Brennan counted to 60. No movement, no German voices, no return fire. He had done it. He saved his rifle, then began the agonizing process of climbing out of the log. His legs, numb from hours of stillness, refused to hold him. He collapsed against the outside of the trunk, massaging circulation back into his calves. His uniform was soaked with sweat and rot. His face was streaked with dirt and frayed wood fibers. But he was alive. And so were the men who would have walked straight into the German ambush. At 11:02, Baker Company appeared, stepping cautiously through the trees. Lieutenant Strickland, their commanding officer, stopped abruptly at the sight of German bodies scattered around the shattered machine gun nest. He found Brennan slumped against the log, rifle across his lap. "What happened here, Brennan?" "They were setting up an ambush, sir," Brennan said quietly. "I stopped it." "You were supposed to observe and report." "Yes, sir." "Not engage?" "Yes, sir." Strickland looked from the MG-42 to the bullet-scarred trail, the same trail his men would have marched through minutes later. "How many?" "8 confirmed," Brennan said. "1 probable. 5 got away." For a moment the officer just stared at him. "You saved my whole company." Brennan shrugged. "Just neutralizing a threat, sir." "That's not doctrine." "Maybe doctrine needs work." Strickland didn't answer. He keyed his radio instead and reported the contact. Battalion wanted Brennan immediately. And so the soldier who had just prevented a massacre was marched to headquarters, not to be congratulated, but to be judged. Brennan walked toward battalion headquarters with the quiet resignation of someone who already knew how the Army worked. Great deeds traveled slower than accusations, and nothing frightened officers more than a private soldier who made decisions without waiting for permission. Strickland had given him a reassuring nod before sending him on his way, but that did little to comfort him. Brennan knew the truth. He had broken the rules. Rules written by men far from the forest, far from the rot and the fog and the ambushes that carved names into gravestones. When he reached HQ at 1340, Captain Holloway was waiting outside the canvas tent, arms folded tight, jaw clenched like he had been chewing glass. Lieutenant Hayes stood beside him, uneasy, avoiding Brennan's eyes. First, Sergeant McKenna leaned against a tree, unreadable. Holloway didn't give him a second to speak. "You disobeyed direct orders?" "Yes, sir." "You engaged the enemy after being told explicitly not to?" "Yes, sir." "You acted independently, jeopardizing intelligence operations and risking compromise of an advanced position?" "Yes, sir." Holloway's face reddened until it nearly matched the officer tabs on his shoulders. "Then tell me why," he demanded. Brennan met his gaze. "Because if I didn't, Baker Company would be dead." Hayes stepped forward, unrolling the map he had brought. "Sir, we've encountered 3 ambush sites this week, each covering a predictable trail, each pre-sighted with machine guns. Those positions alone account for 60% of our casualties." Holloway jabbed a finger at the map. "We attempted to counter these ambushes based on terrain analysis, radio interception, and patrol reconnaissance. We were wrong 3 times. His voice dropped. 42 men died because doctrine assumed the forest behaves like open terrain. He turned back to Brennan. "You found the 4th ambush site. How?" "I moved ahead of our lines," Brennan answered. "Found natural cover. Waited for them." "In a hollow log," Holloway said, disbelieving. "For nearly 7 hours?" "Yes, sir." "That's insanity." "It worked, sir." The words landed between them like a stone. McKenna finally spoke. "Captain, with respect, we've lost 97 men in 3 weeks to German ambushes. Brennan saved an entire company today. If that's grounds for a court-martial, then half the officers in this battalion should stand beside him for letting those ambushes happen in the first place." Holloway stiffened. "That's not how the Army functions, Sergeant." "Maybe the Army should function differently then," McKenna replied. A long silence followed. Wind moved the branches above them. Somewhere in the forest, distant artillery thumped like a heartbeat buried under dirt. Hayes tried to ease the tension. "Sir, I gave Brennan permission to infiltrate and observe. He exceeded the orders, but the outcome was undeniably effective. If we discipline him, we send a clear message. Initiative is a punishable offense." Holloway paced, hands behind his back, breathing hard, as if fighting a war inside himself. "If I let this stand," he said finally, "every marksman in Third Army will think they can wander off and start their own private war." "Or," McKenna replied, "we'll have soldiers who step up, when they see Americans about to die. Another silence. Even the artillery seemed to pause. Holloway faced Brennan squarely. "You understand that by all rights you should be in front of a court today?" "Yes, sir." "You disobeyed orders?" "Yes, sir." "And you'd do it again?" Brennan didn't flinch. "If American lives depended on it?" "Yes, sir." Holloway's shoulders sagged, the fight leaving his posture. "Get out of my sight, Brennan. Report to Lieutenant Hayes immediately. If you're going to behave like a one-man cavalry charge, then you'll at least be a supervised one." It was the closest thing to approval Brennan would ever get from him. Word spread faster than wildfire through the battalion. By evening, every platoon had heard that Brennan spent 7 hours inside a hollow log, killed nearly a dozen Germans, and stopped a slaughter before it started. Soldiers who had mocked him as reckless started approaching him quietly, asking how he did it, how he chose the log, how he stayed still for so long. Private Angelo, one of the scouts who escorted him earlier that morning, told the entire story to his squad. By chow time, half the company knew. Before nightfall, platoon sergeants began sending unofficial inquiries to battalion HQ. "Any chance we can get sniper support like Brennan's? Is he available tomorrow? Can he teach our marksmen what he did?" Among those listening was Staff Sergeant Marcus Wheeler of Charlie Company, a man built like a tree stump, with the quiet authority of someone who ran construction crews before the war. His units had taken severe hits in the woods, ambushed by well-hidden German firing points. He found Brennan sitting on a foxhole rim, cleaning his rifle with deliberate, practiced care. Wheeler sat down without asking. "I need to know how you did it." "Did what, Sergeant?" "Found that log, found the angle, survived long enough to take your shots." Brennan kept polishing the bolt as he answered. "Germans ambush where terrain forces us to move through choke points, trails, clearings, gullies. If I want to stop them, I have to get there first. But I can't dig a hole. They'll spot fresh earth. I can't climb trees. Their snipers already control the canopy." "So you use what's already part of the forest," Wheeler said slowly. "Exactly. Anything old enough to blend in, logs, culverts, craters, broken stone foundations, whatever the forest forgot." Wheeler nodded. "Charlie Company pushes east tomorrow. Germans have a bunker complex near Delta 4 that's been chewing us up. Think this can work there?" "Depends on the ground. Show me." They spent an hour studying the maps under dim lantern light. The forest terrain unfolded like a maze of shadowed possibilities. Brennan pointed out 3 hide sites, a collapsed barn foundation, a drainage culvert, and a cluster of stones on the German side. Wheeler rubbed his chin. "I've got a marksman, Taylor. Good with a rifle. Think you can teach him?" "Teach him what?" "How to be you?" Brennan almost smiled. "It's simple. Find cover that doesn't look like cover. Get there before dawn. Stay perfectly still. Only shoot targets that matter." "That's it?" "That's enough." Wheeler smirked. "Taylor grew up on a farm. He's used to smelling like old wood and dirt. He'll manage." And so the idea began to spread, one marksman at a time. 3 days after Brennan's action in the hollow log, the forest itself seemed to change. American patrols whispered about German movements shifting, about ambush sites appearing in new locations instead of the old predictable trails. Word of the invisible American marksman, or marksman, began reaching German ears. But closer to home, something more significant was happening. By September 21st, 7 different snipers across the battalion were already testing variations of Brennan's approach. Some crawled into drainage culverts that had been forgotten under collapsed roads. Others hid inside burned-out tree stumps left by artillery strikes. One particularly daring corporal spent an entire morning concealed in an abandoned latrine pit the Germans had stopped using, a tactic that disgusted everyone but saved 20 American lives. The results were immediate. German ambushes lost their momentum. The deadly predictability of their machine gun traps began to unravel as unseen American shooters dismantled positions before they could fully form. Battalion S2 compiled the first formal report. Estimated German ambush positions neutralized, 14 estimated American lives saved, 63 originator of tactic, PFC Edward Brennan. The report climbed to regiment, then to division, and then disappeared. No doctrine change, no official note, no commendation, just silence. Because the Army wasn't ready to acknowledge that a 22-year-old private had out-evolved its manuals. But the soldiers didn't need paperwork. They needed survival. On October 3rd, Allied intelligence intercepted a letter written by a German soldier named Otto Richter. He described something their officers couldn't explain. The Americans have changed. Their snipers no longer fire from behind their lines. They come into our territory during the night. They hide in places no man could imagine. We lose men and never find the shooter. He ended with a line that circulated widely among American troops once the intel office translated it. The men call him Der Geist, the ghost. Brennan never heard the letter. He spent those days scouting new infiltration routes and helping younger marksmen choose their hides. He wasn't teaching them to be snipers. They already knew how to shoot. He was teaching them how to think like the forest, how to become part of the terrain until the terrain itself became a weapon. Taylor, the young marksman Wheeler had mentioned, inserted into the collapsed barn foundation at 0420 on the 21st. Dawn hadn't even colored the sky when he settled between charred timbers, covered himself with debris, and let the forest swallow him. When a German observation team approached 30 yards away, he remained stone still, letting their footsteps pass like rain. When they began calling in mortar adjustments, he made his move. One shot, the observer dropped. Another, the assistant fell. A third, the rifleman covering the flank. The rest fled, abandoning the post in confusion. Charlie Company advanced through the area without taking a single casualty. Taylor returned shaking, elated, and terrified, the same look Brennan had worn after his first mission months earlier. And just like that, another quiet ghost took shape. Across the battalion, more men volunteered. Not because they wanted glory, the job offered none, but because every rifleman who had watched a friend die in the dense forest understood that something had to change. By September 25th, it had. Forward infiltration had become a quiet revolution. The numbers reflected it clearly. Before Brennan's tactic, average daily ambush casualties, 4.2. After widespread adoption, average daily ambush casualties, 1 to 1.8. The change was so obvious that even headquarters began to see a pattern, though they pretended not to. Division staff, uncomfortable with innovation that hadn't come from them, simply avoided the subject. But the Germans could not avoid the consequences. Their October operational logs showed growing confusion. They rotated entire platoons after failed ambush attempts. They ordered patrols to check natural cover before establishing firing lines. They moved slowly, cautiously, trying to guess what the Americans were doing. But they were guessing at the impossible. They didn't understand that the forest hid not just soldiers, but strategies. And by mid-October, their doctrine had shifted in ways that revealed just how deeply Brennan's idea had disrupted them. German patrols moved with double the spacing. Machine gun teams hesitated before setting up in obvious choke points. Ambushes, once their most lethal tactic in the Hürtgen, fell in effectiveness by almost half. Because fear had entered the forest, the fear of a rifleman they could not see and could not predict. On October 8th, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance officer filed a short, irritated report. American snipers now operate unpredictably, abandoning traditional positions. Recommend aerial recon before all defensive staging. Enemy displays willingness to infiltrate deeply and remain hidden for extended durations. They had no idea how to counter it. Even if they searched one log, one stump, one wrecked vehicle, there were 1,000 more. For every hollow log Brennan used, 1,000 others waited somewhere in the endless German forest. And that was the point. The tactic was not a trick. It was a system the Germans couldn't solve with maps or doctrine or orders. Meanwhile, back at American headquarters, the officers wrestled with a different kind of problem. Lieutenant Colonel Webb, the battalion executive officer, finally raised the question nobody wanted to say out loud. Are we going to formalize this? He looked around the command tent at Holloway, Hayes, and McKenna. Rain hammered outside like fists on a coffin lid. Inside, their maps lay scattered with casualty reports and terrain sketches. We have 12 snipers operating independently, Webb continued. No unified doctrine, no standardized training, no oversight. It's working, yes, but we're building a system on improvisation. Holloway rubbed his temples. If we formalize it, we claim responsibility. And if a sniper is caught behind German lines, we're liable for violating doctrine. Hayes added quietly, the Germans consider such soldiers partisans. Historically, that means execution. McKenna leaned back. Sir, they've been doing it for weeks, and not a single man has been lost doing it. At some point, we need to admit the obvious. It works. Webb tapped the map with a pencil. Division will never approve it. Too unconventional, too risky. But regiment might not stop us if we frame it correctly. So we continue unofficially? Holloway asked. No, we create guidelines, Webb said, choosing each word carefully. Not doctrine, guidelines for designated marksmen in restricted terrain. Hayes raised an eyebrow. That's bureaucratic enough to get past anyone. Exactly, Webb said. This way, we change reality without pretending we change doctrine. On October 15th, a 2-page mimeographed document circulated. Technical Bulletin, NARA 4, Designated Marksman Employment in High-Density Forest Environments. It never mentioned hollow logs, infiltration, or anything that would make a general nervous. It simply stated, marksmen may establish observation positions forward of friendly lines when terrain prevents conventional overwatch, provided communication protocols and escape routes are pre-planned. Translation: do what Brennan did, but tell someone first. And with that, Brennan's improvised survival tactic became the beating heart of a new way of fighting. A way the Army would later claim was its idea all along. By early November, the shift in tactics had spread far beyond Brennan's battalion. Word traveled quickly among units in the Hürtgen through whispered stories, after-action rumors, and the kind of quiet admiration soldiers reserved for those who did the impossible. 19 snipers across 3 corps now used forward infiltration. Some were seasoned marksmen, others were young riflemen who learned from necessity. But all of them shared one thing. They no longer waited for the enemy to dictate the first move. Battalion S2, now tracking the results more closely, compiled another set of numbers. Before forward infiltration, enemy ambush casualties, 127 ambush positions neutralized. 3 average warning time, 0 minutes. After forward infiltration, enemy ambush casualties, 47 ambush positions neutralized, 31 average warning time, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. In the Hürtgen, 15 minutes could mean the difference between a company walking into a killing zone and artillery erasing that killing zone before boots touched the ground. The math didn't need interpretation. The forest did. Despite overwhelming data, division staff insisted no doctrine would change until post-campaign analysis. No medals, no recognition, no official mention of Brennan or anyone following his method. But the soldiers cared little for paperwork. All they cared about was the growing feeling, for the first time in weeks, that they could survive this forest. The enemy felt the shift as well. German operational reports from late October described increasing frustration. Machine gun nests that had once operated with near impunity were suddenly being destroyed before they fired a shot. Patrols were ambushed by unseen Americans who melted into the terrain. One report described a sniper position found after the shooter had withdrawn. A hollowed stump indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. Impossible to detect until inspection at arm's length. Unacceptable threat. Recommend immediate adjustment of doctrine for all woodland engagements. The Germans made changes. Increased patrols, forced reconnaissance sweeps, sporadic shifts in machine gun placement. But every change slowed them down. Every hesitation bought Americans more time. Every search took manpower away from their offensive plan. Forward infiltration wasn't just killing German soldiers, it was killing German rhythm. On November 8th, Brennan performed his 23rd infiltration. A collapsed root cellar 400 yards behind the German front line served as his hide. He spent 11 hours inside, body pressed against cool earth, surrounded by broken stones and tangled roots. He shot 4 Germans during that mission, a mortar team preparing to fire on advancing American units. His shots shattered their preparation, scattering them before they could drop a single round. He exfiltrated at dusk, unnoticed. To Brennan, it felt routine. Another day, another hide, another set of lives saved without fanfare. To the battalion, it was further proof of something they all now quietly believed. He had changed the way they fought. That same morning, First Sergeant McKenna submitted paperwork recommending Brennan for the Silver Star. Captain Holloway signed it without hesitation. Lieutenant Colonel Webb added his name. The recommendation traveled upward to division. Division reviewed it. Then they stamped it. Disapproved. Reason: insufficient documentation of actions under fire. A bureaucratic way of saying, we will not reward a soldier who broke doctrine, even if he saved hundreds of lives doing it. No one told Brennan the full story. McKenna only said, "Not this time," and Brennan nodded, unsurprised. Recognition was never something he expected. He wasn't fighting for medals. He was fighting to keep the men marching beside him alive. Meanwhile, the Hürtgen Forest continued taking its toll. The campaign dragged into December, leaving tens of thousands dead on both sides. A battle with no grand cinematic charge, no wide-open fields, just endless trees and mud and invisible threats lurking behind every trunk. But within one battalion, Brennan's battalion, the numbers told a different story. Casualties from ambush had dropped by 63%. 63. It meant men who should have died did not. It meant mothers who would have received telegrams never did. It meant Christmas letters were written that otherwise would have ended as memorials. By the end of the campaign, this method, Brennan's method, had spread to 7 divisions in 3rd and 7th Armies. It no longer belonged to a single soldier. It belonged to the entire American force in the forest. Yet doctrine remained unchanged. Not officially, anyway. The 1943 Field Manual for Snipers still sat in command posts across Europe, declaring that snipers belonged behind the lines, offering overwatch, firing from stable, doctrinally correct positions. But in the real world, where doctrine met mud and blood, commanders and NCOs began quietly teaching new tactics to incoming marksmen. Find your hide forward, blend with the terrain, disrupt the ambush before it forms. Shoot only what matters. Disappear. They didn't call it innovation. They called it survival. When the Hürtgen finally quieted in late December, the forest looked less like a battlefield and more like the remains of a world that had given up. Frozen mud swallowed helmets and shell fragments. Trees, once towering and ancient, now stood shredded and charred, their splintered trunks pointing toward a sky that had rained steel for weeks. American units moved past the forest, bypassing pockets of resistance. They had sacrificed thousands of lives to gain a few miles of ground that, in the end, proved strategically meaningless. But to Brennan's battalion, something else mattered far more than territory. They had survived. Not all of them, no. The Hürtgen's price had been brutal. But ambush deaths, the most senseless and demoralizing kind, had dropped sharply. Men who would have died without ever seeing the enemy now walked out of the forest alive. And although nobody wrote it into reports or carved it into marble, the truth was obvious to anyone who had been there. One idea, born from frustration, fear, and a hollow, rotting log, had changed the way Americans fought in woods like these. After Germany surrendered, the U.S. Army launched a series of operational studies to sift through what had happened across the European theater. Researchers gathered maps, after-action reports, interrogation transcripts, and field notes from dozens of units. One classified report examined the surprising effectiveness of forward concealment positions, especially in dense terrain. It recommended further study and future inclusion in post-war doctrine. It did not mention Brennan by name. It didn't need to, because by then the idea had spread far beyond any single soldier. By 1954, every sniper school in the American military taught forward infiltration as a core tactic. They renamed it Hide Site Selection and Establishment. They paired it with diagrams, illustrated manuals, training films, and field demonstrations. Recruits practiced for hours constructing hides inside collapsed barns, under uprooted trees, beneath vehicle wrecks, never knowing that the first version had been a decayed log in a German forest, chosen by a private who simply refused to let his friends die. Brennan, meanwhile, returned home quietly. He was discharged in October 1945 at Camp Kilmer with the rank of sergeant and nothing more than his combat infantryman badge and a train ticket back to Pennsylvania. He went home to Johnstown, back to the salvage yard where he used to work before the war, back to the smell of rust and machine oil, back to being unnoticed, something he had become skilled at long before the Army ever taught him how to hide. He married Helen, the nurse he'd known from high school. They raised 3 children. He never told them about the log, never described what the inside of rotting wood felt like, never mentioned the 14 shots that changed the lives of men he barely knew. Sometimes in the fall, when the air carried that damp, earthy smell, he would grow quiet, a long, distant quiet, but he never explained why. In 1963, a military historian researching unconventional white Turu tactics uncovered Technical Bulletin NARA 44 while combing through old archives. The wording was vague, the authorship unclear, but the pattern pointed to a single incident in September 1944. One private, one hollow log, one ambush thwarted that should have destroyed a company. The historian spent 2 years tracking the story, following it from dusty file drawers to personal letters to the memories of aging veterans. Eventually, he found Brennan working a crane at Johnstown Salvage and Scrap, 2 days away from retirement. The historian introduced himself and asked if Brennan remembered September 18, 1944. Brennan smiled politely and said, "Can't say I do. What happened?" So the historian laid it out, the reports, the casualty reductions, the way the tactics spread through the Army, the doctrine that evolved from it. He explained that modern sniper instruction traced its roots to that single decision Brennan made inside a decaying oak log in the Hürtgen Forest. Brennan listened quietly, then shrugged. "That's interesting. Do you want to say anything about it for the record?" the historian asked. Brennan shook his head. "I just didn't want to watch any more kids die. That's all." The historian later published a paper titled The Evolution of American Sniper Doctrine, 1944 to 1965. It identified Brennan as the originator of forward infiltration techniques. It credited him with saving roughly 200 lives, directly and indirectly. The paper circulated through military schools and history departments, but nobody sent Brennan a copy. He never knew how widely his idea had traveled. In April 1992, Brennan passed away at 71 from complications of emphysema. His local newspaper printed a small obituary, 4 paragraphs. It mentioned he was a WWQ veteran, worked 47 years in salvage, left behind a wife, children, and grandchildren. One line mentioned he served as an infantry sniper. Nothing about the hollow log, nothing about the doctrine he changed, nothing about the lives he saved. His funeral drew 43 people, family, co-workers, and a few old soldiers who had served with him long before the world knew anything about forward infiltration. They buried him in Grandview Cemetery, overlooking the valley where Bethlehem steel used to roar with fire, where his father once worked the furnaces, where Brennan learned as a boy that systems sometimes fail, and that sometimes someone must step forward. Years later, in 2015, the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning unveiled a new memorial wall dedicated to the evolution of American sniper doctrine. 7 bronze plaques detailed every major innovation from the First World War to Iraq. One plaque described the shift to forward infiltration and hide site utilization during W1 It called the tactic a significant adaptation to dense combat terrain. It did not mention Brennan, but in a quiet section of Arlington National Cemetery, on a memorial wall honoring soldiers whose innovations changed warfare but went largely unrecognized, there is a name inscribed, Edward Eddie Brennan, row 10, column 3. Most visitors walk past without noticing. Most never ask who he was. And that's fitting in a way, because real change in war rarely announces itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with medals or parades. It arrives through soldiers who see a failure in the system and decide to fix it, not for glory, not for history, but to save the lives beside them. That is the story of Eddie Brennan, a young man in a rotten log who changed how armies fight without ever asking for anything in return. A soldier who broke rules because the rules were killing people. A man who turned stillness, patience, and stubborn resolve into a weapon the enemy never understood. He didn't write doctrine. He didn't command battalions. He didn't seek recognition. He just acted when the forest swallowed the world, and silence was the only thing keeping anyone alive. If this story moved you, keep it alive. Share it, remember it, and honor the nameless soldiers whose quiet decisions shaped history more than any medal ever could.